Hi, this is Richard from Regenerative, and I'm joined by Gwen Grelet, who's a researcher at LandCare Research, and we're going to talk today about some of the research in regenerative agriculture happening in New Zealand. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I was just wondering, maybe to start with, we could discuss some of the research going on at the moment in regenerative agriculture in New Zealand.
Oh, overall, the entire sum of research that is going on?
Oh, maybe some of the projects you're involved in, sorry.
I think that would be much better. So at the moment, we are wrapping up the writing of some of the data we have acquired with our pilot experiment that we started at the end of 2019. And what we did is we sampled 6 pairs of farms, and within each pair we had one farm that labeled itself as being regenerative and its neighbor. And we went there and we identified locations on each of the farm that were exactly matched and comparable to a similar location on the neighboring farm. And then we measured a whole bunch of stuff. And we are currently analyzing the data. So we measured carbon stocks in the soil, nitrogen stocks, water infiltration, and loads of measures of biodiversity and plant biodiversity, nematodes, bacteria, fungi, protists, insects, spiders. And so our intent in this project was to, first of all, understand what a farm that is taking itself as being regenerative, what does it look like? What are the practices that are being deployed exactly? And also, what are the best indicators of environmental performance that we should aim to measure when we are trying to assess the impact of regenerative agriculture? And you know, assessing soil health is on one hand is quite easy, but on the other hand is actually quite complicated. There's loads of indicators that could be measured. If you start diving into the topic of soil fertility and soil test, there's a lot of them. Which one do you choose? And some are considered suitable by some parties, some are, and others prefer using different soil tests. So just the concept of soil test is starting to pose questions to which one to use, what do they actually indicate, and and so on. And for biodiversity is the same, and for stocks and different way of measuring and so on. So we did quite a range of tests, and we're currently looking through the data. And we're starting to have some really cool results. This was really a pilot experiment, and we didn't have a huge grant to begin with. And so the results are likely to not show very significant differences between the two sides of the pair, because we don't have a lot of replication. It's only 6 pairs. But it's interesting still. It's really highlighting that some indicators are much more suited to detect difference, especially in terms of biodiversity and the relationship with the performance of the soil.
And how hard was it to define what regenerative agriculture was in that research setting?
Well, we didn't actually really. This is not, in a way. I don't think there is such a thing as a regenerative agriculture or regenerative farm. I think it's a gradient, it's a continuum. And so some farmers might not label themselves as regenerative farmers, but they're actually deploying the same type of practices and the same approach to management than other farmers that think of themselves as being regenerative, and vice versa. And so for us scientists, we are really trying to avoid taking a black and white approach, but come up with methodology that allows rigorous testing of hypotheses. So if, for example, we can come up with a practice matrix, so what should we pay attention in terms of the practices that are being deployed on farm. Is it, for example, the type of fertilizer, the amount of fertilizer being used, whether the soil has been tilled or not tilled, what type of tillage, whether the plant diversity has been increased by, say, seeding, say a diverse pasture mix or cover crops or things like that, whether what are the characteristics of the grazing management. So it's really trying to figure out how we describe these most adequately in a way that is systematic, so we can then use this as factors in our statistical analysis. Does that make sense?
And so you're saying soil health was what you measured as the indication that it was successful, the regenerative agriculture approaches?
So we measured a whole bunch of environmental variable, focusing mostly on soil, because regenerative agriculture has put such a focus on soil and improving soil health. And so all of the indicators that we've measured can somewhat be linked to soil health, right? So, but in different ways. So, for example, we did score soil health using the visual soil assessment, but we also measured all of the carbon stocks, nitrogen stock, phosphorus concentration, micronutrient concentration, CEC, water infiltration, soil aggregate size and stability, for example, earthworms quantity and diversity, nematode quantity and diversity. And for each of them, you can, from each of the results from each category, you can infer some conclusion about the state of the soil. But then to get to the next step and to say the soil of that farm is healthier than the soil of this other farm, it really depends what it is that you're looking for in terms of assessing soil health, right? Overall, you can integrate those data and make some conclusion that one soil is performing in a particular way better than the other. But at the moment, I'm still relatively unconvinced to making statement about this type of indicators will allow us to say that the soil is healthier than other type of indicators. Like you could have, for example, you could have a huge, some people would say that if you increase diversity, then your soil is healthier, but you could have a huge increase in bacterial diversity and doesn't mean that your soil is healthier. So it depends on what you're measuring.
But it sounds like there's a good range of different variables in soil that you can use to validate that those practices are having a beneficial impact on the health of that system.
Yes, and just to be precise there and to express clarity, this is for research purposes, right? There are many ways that farmers can assess whether their soils are performing well or not. Especially if you're repeating those measurements over time, then you're seeing what are the trends? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? The purpose of what we're doing is we're trying to distinguish what is the impact of the practice on the soil, and we are trying to compare different locations against each other. So, and some of these indicators have been benchmarked, and some others are not benchmarked. So we can't say, if we get say so much number of nematode of that particular species, it's high or it's low. We can't say that because there's not been a benchmark for this.
Right. Are there any of those variables you're measuring that could be adopted by the farmers to test themselves?
Yeah, I mean, what we've tried to do is to include as many of the measures that are used by farmers on a routine basis. We've tried to draw from the pool of measurement that some of the regenerative farmers are deploying, as well as the more conventional measures. And we've also included some measures that are only used by researchers. And it's just to get a range of what's out there, what are people doing, and what does it mean for us? How feasible is it? How costly is it? If we were to really increase the replication of our study, which of these measurements would we focus mostly on? which offer the more insight per cost and per time required.
And is there any particular strengths at the moment in New Zealand farming as far as the range of those farming practices that you're looking at? Is there any that they're doing particularly well so far?
Can you repeat your question? Just making sure I understood. You're asking me if there are practices that are leading to better outcome.
Yeah, you're mentioning at the start you're measuring continuums and practices and farming practices that were linked to regenerative farming practices. Is there any in particular that the New Zealand farmers are doing well at the moment?
You mean that they are implementing well, or that are leading to good impact?
Any farming practices that they're doing well at the moment?
I think there's a range. There are. I have visited farms that have successfully increased the diversity of the plants that they are growing on their farm, and they have managed. So this is mostly most of the work I've done so far in terms of taking measurement. Are pastoral farms, and so some of the farms I've visited have managed to increase the diversity of their of the forage, in a way that they promote the species that are desirable. There's been quite a lot of effort deployed by the community to optimize the grazing management, because a lot of the grazing management that is prescribed, or not prescribed, but talked about and discussed in the context of regenerative agriculture is drawn from management strategies that have been developed overseas. For example, the LandCare Institute talked about holistic plant grazing, and so it needs to be adapted for each context. And I have visited farms where the holistic plant grazing management has been implemented quite successfully. Still, I mean, it's always a never-ending journey, right? But I've seen some amazing operations being implemented. I visited a farm where a farmer is attempting to sow a range of cereals amongst the conventional pasture species, and they're very nutritious for the cattle. Is growing cattle mostly, and is managed to do that and control exactly when those cereals are growing, and managing the transition between the more grass-based pasture versus a pasture that also includes cereals. Manage this successfully using grazing and periods of drought. So we didn't have to use, say, glyphosate to transition from one type of vegetation to another. So to me, that's really quite skilled craftsmanship. It required a lot of optimization and observation of the system, and working with the contextual climate. So for me, that's really successful, for example. And his animals are thriving, and it's, for me, it's a mark of success.
And is there anything in the New Zealand context that you've come across that's a little bit different in how regenerative agriculture is applied?
So something that is specific to New Zealand versus elsewhere?
Well, maybe what kind of context is regenerative agriculture being adopted mostly in New Zealand?
What kind of context?
Yeah.
I think there are people trialing various aspects of regenerative agriculture in pretty much all sectors, all ag sectors. you could even extend the concept to forestry and talk about regenerative forestry.
Mm.
So I think it's not, there's a lot of pastoral farmers that are sheep and beef in the flat country, hill country, high country. They're all doing it differently, adapted to their context. There are some, of course, arable farmers, market gardeners, viticulture, horticulture. So I think it's been adopted in all ag sectors to a different extent, and each of them will present different challenges. What is different here compared to other places in the world? I think one of our challenges is how we, especially for our sheep and beef farmers, is how we improve the financial and climatic resilience of our operations, as well as nurture native biodiversity, because a lot of our native biodiversity is on sheep and beef properties. How we do that well, I think we still have to work together to do that. I don't think we're there yet. There's multiple things that, multiple factors to take into account, and so that I think that's a unique challenge for New Zealand, this one. Another challenge, which I'm sure occurs in other countries, but I only in certain area, is how we perhaps embrace regenerative agriculture to also restore our wetland, and that would be mostly applicable in for example, around in areas where there is a lot of dairy farming, because a lot of these wetlands have been drained or are not very are not necessarily nurtured well. And then the other thing that is quite specific to New Zealand is the soil carbon, managing our soil carbon. So in areas of our country, we already have really high level of soil carbon. And so in those areas, do we have to adapt the management so that we keep holding on to this carbon? Or do we actually have to really try to build more carbon in the soil? And I don't think we have that answer.
In those areas in the farm where you want to preserve the biodiversity and the wetlands that are on those sites, is there opportunities to integrate them into farming production as well, or is it more fencing them off and keeping them separate and protecting them?
So I think the way we deal with wetlands is different from the way we deal with other type of native biodiversity, especially hill country. And I think in wetland, I don't know. This is a little bit outside my area of expertise. From the little I've seen and read, I think for wetland we probably have no other option than to remove ourselves from those areas and restore them, let them to regenerate. For native biodiversity in hill and high country, I think it's a mixture of removing ourselves from certain areas to foster native regeneration, and also actively managing that, because native regeneration also requires a lot of human input in a way. We controlling the predators, and controlling some of the invading weeds sometimes can be done via grazing. So in there could be some kind of synergy, and I don't know enough to say where, which, when, how. There are some New Zealand experts that you can talk to about that. I've spent an entire career.
In any of those sites that you visited, are they doing different types of regenerative production on the same site, or do they tend to specialize on one particular type?
So you're asking me if I've seen many farms where there is a diversity of enterprises?
Yeah, yeah.
I think the greatest diversity I've seen is milk, as well as some meat, as well as some chicken.
Mm.
On one hand, that's just, in terms of farm produce, and the other type of diversity I've seen is when there is a mixture between growing food from the land and ecotourism, for example.
Mm.
I haven't visited places where there are much more extreme version of regenerative agriculture, such as syntropy or fit food forest, or and where I believe it could be this potential for high diversity of enterprises there.
Mm.
I haven't visited those places, but in my opinion, it's the way to go, and I think there's still a long way to go for most landowners.
Yeah. I imagine for many of them, it's as those strategies are developing, it's easier to focus on one context and get that working right in that context before diversifying too much initially, at least.
Possibly. There's multiple scenarios possible. Yeah.
So what have you found most interesting so far with the regenerative agriculture philosophy, and what have you found most appealing about it?
I think what is really appealing for me is the concept of hope that is inherent in that movement. So it's a movement that is really solution focused and possibilities focused, and it really contrasts with the current psychological and social climate, where most people that start looking at the state of our economy, society, and environment can become desperate and disillusioned and wondering, whether we've already reached tipping point and gone beyond the threshold and point of no return. And so, and there are many such people in my circle, because my primary circle in my professional life is people concerned with ecology and of course and climate change. And so it's like a big complex problem and challenge that the whole world has to face. And what I think is really inspiring is that the regenerative agriculture movement is really taking one step at a time, practical, but also having a really big vision and a high level of hope. So for me, that's probably the most inspiring. What I really like as well is the fact that most farmers that I meet are really, how would I say that? They're eager to learn and to learn new things and how to do things, what to know, new sources of knowledge, practical or theoretical. And the other thing that I find really inspiring is the acknowledgement that life is not just about things that are material. So the fact that every farming operation has multiple dimensions, and the emotional dimension, and some would say maybe the spiritual dimension of the farm is also contributing to the success, not just the economic or even the biophysical and environmental dimension. And I find that really healthy, because then it's really inclusive and it's a holistic approach. And I think that approach is being taken by people other than farmers, and for me, I think that's the way to go.
So it sounds like that hopeful approach kind of makes them more open to perceiving more opportunities and seeing in a more holistic context.
Possibly. I don't know what drives what. It could be the reverse, it's a chicken and an egg question.
Yeah. But in either case, it empowers their mindset to approach the challenges we face more constructively and come up with better solutions.
Yes, it could be, it could be that the founder of this movement were people that were anyway functioning in that way. And then they are setting some kind of a culture. And then when people start interacting in close proximity to them or listening to them, then they're inspired and they too have some kind of a mindset shift. Yeah.
And who's inspired you in that space most so far?
Oh, you want me to name people?
Well, or what kind of philosophies have inspired you, or different approaches have you found most intriguing?
I'm super inspired by syntropy. Find that fascinating.
Okay.
The people that I've found extremely inspiring, Nicole Masters, who is originally Kiwi, who now lives in the state.
I'm listening to an audiobook now. It's a good one.
Yeah. Dwayne Beck in the US. Yeah. I mean, there's so many people. Yeah. It's just walking in the footprint of giants.
What is it about that synergy approach that you like?
The syntropy approach.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the syntropy approach is really, it's really kind of pushing the it's a way of managing the land and the ecosystem, and that includes the human being part of the ecosystem, so as to absolutely maximize synergies, and it includes woody species. A lot of the regenerative agriculture operation that I've visited don't necessarily take into account woody species, and I think there's more and more evidence emerging that trees have a particular role to play in, for example, climate regulation. And so, yeah, I find that I mean, it's a whole package, and I find it quite interesting and inspiring. And I'm not sure how scalable it is, and I'm not sure how we can really successfully integrate it in our current farming system. But it's certainly something to consider. It's an extreme version of agroforestry and silvopastures. So.
Yeah, I've seen that overseas, and people adopting regenerative agriculture, how they try to emulate the natural ecosystems that function in those environments, and how in the New Zealand context that would be a forest, and how you can potentially develop regenerative agriculture systems using a lot more trees in our context. I was thinking that might be something quite unique about how it emerges in New Zealand in the future.
Yes, I don't know about that. I find I think this is like a super interesting question to ask, because indeed overseas they are trying to emulate the kind of the natural ecosystem, and when they introduce trees, there would be trees that are native to that environment. I don't know how compatible any of our native species are with any of the production species that we are that we are growing here. So.
Yeah, I've heard they're not.
Yeah, and so
Catholic, there's a bit of a clash, isn't there? Like one's developed in the northern hemisphere and one's in the south, and they're quite evolutionarily different from each other.
Yeah, well, they could be evolutionarily different, but still work hand in hand. But for example, you have that's why you have invasion and invasive species, right? Because they manage to adapt to an environment that is alien to them. So there are processes where you can have species that have not evolved together, but living happily together. But I think there are constrained on having a thriving native forest that are almost incompatible with having a thriving productive system. So can we optimize landscape configuration, for example, where we would have little bits of patches of the land that is being restored to a native ecosystem? Is that going to work? Because you need to account for connectivity, etc. And I don't know. I think it's fascinating.
And
or
even adopting whole new approaches to agriculture using those natural environments, that haven't even been explored yet.
Yep, correct. If you're trying to manage one particular, so say for example, you could actually introduce in your landscape certain plants that are also exotic and plants that are native that would help boost up the population of birds, our native birds, without necessarily restoring the ecosystem to its native state. That is possible. So it depends on which species you're trying to manage for.
Have you come across something I've heard as with South American species, they're more compatible to New Zealand species, and there's a lot more food species in those types of forests. Have you come across anyone exploring the integration of South American and New Zealand species and developing novel new agricultural systems from that?
Not in practice. I've had conversation with Charles Merfield, for example, talking about this. And, for example, if we were to explore bringing grazing birds that would be similar to the type of birds we used to have in New Zealand, widely spread, and, bigger birds. And what would that look like? But I don't know of anyone who's really tried it.
Have to try it.
Yes.
And what kind of frameworks, maybe just to finish with, have you found most useful with applying regenerative agriculture? You mentioned syntropy. Does that offer a good approach to apply regenerative agriculture, or are there other systems that are useful?
Okay, so yeah, it's slightly different. So I think the framework that I'm not sure. I'm going to answer, but it's maybe not answering to your specific question. Sure. I think syntropy or agroforestry or silvopasture or integrated pest management and so on, they are kind of a set of technique or practices that you can put together, and they are also linked. They of course linked to a way of looking at your landscape, right? It's not just things that people do. But they are still kind of in a way specific, or like permaculture or holistic plant grazing, etc. I think what I found really useful is those principles that have been derived. So the 6 principles of soil health that came out of the Soil Health Academy in the US, and then those 11 principles that have emerged from the work we did with a consortium of farmers, researchers, industry, bankers, veterinarian, a lot of people that Samuel Lang and myself co-led. And those principles I think they provide a really clear framework, and they allow the context specificity. So they are flexible enough that they can be adapted to every context, but they provide a framework. And so half of these principles are about your attitude. And, for example, one of these principles is learn together. Another one is question everything. And the other half of these principles are related to how you manage the landscapes. And they are very much similar to the 6 principles of the Soil Health Academy. So, have something growing all year round, maximize photosynthesis all year round. So avoid having, say, bare ground and shallow.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
I've come across different principles being used, and sometimes they don't sound like actions that you can take, but they sound like they're quite clear actions that you can align yourself to get those regenerative outcomes.
Yes, yes, they are very. They are beyond being philosophical. They're actually things that you can put in.
Concrete.
They include the philosophy, but they are things that you can actually do. No, they are tangible principles.
Yeah, that sounds
Yes.
good.
So
What was the
they are.
research to find more about that one?
So you can read all of that in the white paper that we published at the end of February this year,
Okay.
which is publicly available. I can give you a link if you want to share it around.
Okay, yeah, that'd be good. Thank you.
Yep.
Cool. Well, thank you. Maybe just one last question. What are you most curious about at the moment? What are some of the things that you're more curious about finding more about in regenerative agriculture at the moment?
At this very moment in time. I've got a couple of things that I'm focusing my mind into at the moment. So one is, how do we integrate what we do at the farm level with the impact it might have on the greater scales, your catchment, your region, and vice versa. So how do you adapt what you're doing based on what's happening in your area around you, and how do we create change when each individual farmer is only able to change what he or she is doing on their particular piece of land, whereas the change would actually require things to be, actions to be taken at much greater scale. So how do we get that? This is almost like the dynamic of your theory of change. How do you manage this? What can I do as a researcher to help with that? And at what scale are you looking at measuring impact? So if you say that you're having a positive impact on the freshwater, everything in your water is really affected by everything that is happening around that water catchment, and so it's not that easy. It's not as just because you're going to measuring what's happening in the water on your farm. It doesn't mean that you will see the differences that you are creating in the water, because you might that might be a noise compared to huge differences created by someone else that also has access to that same water catchment. So if you are downstream from a property that is offloading a lot of sediments or nitrogen, regardless of how you're changing your practices, it's going to be very difficult for you to detect that difference in the water on your farm. And then the other thing that I've been thinking quite a bit about, which is of course due to accelerated by the event this week, is, so how do we measure and assess resilience, and how we decide what is leading to greater resilience in a community, in a farming community, and then the connectivity with the urban community, because right now in Canterbury, everybody's affected. You have bridges collapse or unpassable and so on. So how do we together as a collective increase this resilience, and how do we track whether we are achieving that increase or not?
And is there any community structures like maybe local iwi that offer a good way to bring about that collective working together?
Yes, I'm sure there are, and I'm sure there are frameworks to assess that, and you're correct. And some might be easily transferable and applicable, and some might not. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much for your time today and sharing all your thoughts. It's really interesting and inspiring to hear about what's been going on, and wishing you the best in your future research.
And thank you, and to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.